Well, nasa nayakit Nietzsche ake. So, nayakit Greymorning. I am a professor at the University of Montana. My fields of study are a bit broad. By training, I'm a political anthropologist, but the field of anthropology is a four field. And so we had to cover, as graduate students, we had to cover four subfields of anthropology. So linguistic anthropology was one of them. Medical anthropology was another area. Cultural, obviously, was another area. Um, and I guess historical was, I can't even remember what my fourth area was anymore. Oh, myth and folklore. And I'm actually published in four different fields: medical anthropology, legal anthropology, which is part of political anthropology, cultural anthropology, and linguistic anthropology.
Wow, you are not kidding when you say diverse. That's a wide range there. So you mentioned linguistics, and that really caught my attention when I was researching you because it's something that I really don't think about too much. I do know that there are problems in the greater Native American community that are pretty much ignored in politics. But I didn't think about language much. So can you tell me about the importance of retaining Native American languages?
Okay, so before I actually get into that, there really is a difference in linguistics. There's a difference in what linguists do and what people do who are trying to save their language or maintain their language. Linguists study language, and I think it was back in 2002, Scientific American did I think a 6-page spread on saving dying languages, in which they pointed out that the field of linguistics has really done little to actually look at the fact that all of these indigenous languages globally are disappearing. Their interest is, we want to study these languages minutely, but I gave a talk that was titled Nurturing the Garden of Language, in which I looked at language as being a garden that flourishes with beautiful flowers, and people come to the garden and they want to take pictures, and they're not concerned that the flowers are wilting. They want to catch those flowers at their zenith, at their brightest and brilliance in blooming, and then others come and they take snippings of the flowers, and they'll do all these things, but the garden is withering. And that was the analogy, linguistics, that tied to Scientific American article on saving dying languages. That, and this was 2002. I think the field is trying to change now, but the point was that we are losing languages at a rapid speed, and linguists are studying languages, and it hasn't really helped the fact that languages are disappearing.
Okay.
So now back to your question, which was?
Just about the importance of maintaining Native American languages in general, both culturally and politically, if that applies.
Oh, well, because I am a political anthropologist, I'll address the political aspect.
Great.
I never really wanted to get into politics, any kind of political issues. I always tried to stay away from it. And then I realized I was being dragged into it in one way or another. But if we look at it from a real basic perspective, one of the things that separates indigenous North Americans from people that emigrated here from other parts of the world is we have our distinct languages. And those languages identify us as who we are. Once those languages are gone, well, let's look at the United States. So Indigenous people in the United States are on reservations. And a lot of those reservations are sitting above rich resources that companies and governments would want to get at, and they do things to try to get at them. One of the things that buffer us from the larger population is our language and our cultures. When those languages are gone, then the outside people, I'd like to say cultures, but the outside body politic, I'll use that term, they will say, and this has happened already, you're no longer a native. You don't speak, you speak English just like us. You dress just like us. How can you identify as being native when you're doing everything like us, including speaking our language, and you no longer have your language? And there are lots of people that have been saying those kinds of things for the past 15 years. And within the Native community, the Indigenous community, people have not been buffering themselves against that because the languages are still slipping away.
I would have never even thought of that. So thank you for telling me about that.
Well, let me add to that. Let me add one other piece to that. The fact that language has identified people is nothing new. Before the United Nations, there was a League of Nations. And during that time period and a little bit earlier, people were defined by having a single language. And what evolved out of that, I mean, we identified that as, one of the identified markers of that is the fact that we wound up calling Germans, we wound up saying that Germans speak German, Chinese speak Chinese, the Japanese speak Japanese, and the French speak French. So you see how the language tied to a national identity. And that has carried down to present day. And politically now, people are not really looking at that, because when you have a government that says you only exist because we've given you that right, we have sovereignty over you, you don't speak your, and they have historically worked to define Indigenous people in the United States based on criteria that suits them, the larger body politic. Then they can come in and say, you're no longer Native.
That is rather horrifying. And it actually, one of the reasons I wanted to hear from you is because I do know that Native American issues are almost largely ignored. And correct me if I am wrong here, but it sounds like what you're saying is the destruction of language is only going to make it worse, the political ignoring the problems of Native Americans. Yes. Okay. Shoot. This is going to maybe the toughest one yet. Is there anything that we can do about this? I know that's not always easy.
Well, ironically, I just finished, I think I told you in the email, I just finished a 4-day, well, let me back up a little bit because my schedule is really busy. I developed one of the strongest methodologies for second language acquisition that exists. And people would say, you're just tooting your own horn and all sorts of stuff. But the things that students learn in my class, I was not hired at the university to teach a language. I started teaching Arapaho because of the dire condition of that Indigenous people face with their languages. And I had developed this method. And I have been running workshops for the past 18 years to try to get people to understand that there's something effective that can be used to save your language. Now, I made the statement that it's one of the most effective tools for language learning there, and I don't base that as just some idle words. In the first 12 years that I taught, now I guess we'll leave it at 12 years. In the first 12 years that I taught Arapaho at the university, every single student in every exam leading up to the final got an A on their exam. These are oral exams. And all students got A's on the final oral exam, which sometimes took as long as 2 hours for a single student to take. But students were taking the exams one student at a time, every single student aced their exam. They may have lost 3 points or 5 points here and there, but they still got an A. And there's no other language that's being taught globally that could say for 12 years running, every student got an A. And the students are not coming out or being tested with some easy stuff. I have a website that shows the kind of language that students are walking away with. Loose translations would be, well, I would say to a student, Hanen tiakutasihi tiakuta na nayeti wathanahai chitau ha'awu hata eta and I. And they will know precisely what I'm saying, and they can say that. But the thing is, I could say that to a student for the first time through the method that I developed, and having heard it for the first time, they can demonstrate that they understand what's being said. In a student's first roughly 10 hours of instruction, they are on top of somewhere between 160 and 200 phrases that they understand and can give back to me.
So it sounds like you have not only a method, but a very effective method. So hopefully that can be spread.
But it hasn't been.
It hasn't been.
No.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem. Just last night, I ended up 4 days running a Zoom language teacher workshop with a group I've been working with in Australia for the past since 2015. So 2015, 17, 18, and 19, so 4 years. When I first started working with them, they had one person who was he was proficient in the language. Even he would say his proficiency at that point in time was nowhere where it is now. But he was trying to carry it all himself. The people that he was trying to teach, I don't think could put two sentences together. Now, after working with them, we have developed some 14 very highly proficient language speakers who are teaching over 700 people.
Oh, wow.
That's how great. You say the language. Say language with numbers. And the thing is, on Tuesday, I gave an exercise that I had done to the same group in 2019. I gave a student, I said, here, I'm giving you a story you've never seen before because it comes from the plains. You have one evening to translate it into your language, and then you're going to teach that story to your class. And so, again, they didn't quite do it the way I anticipated, but the results were amazing because he set it up according to ASLA, Accelerated Second Language Acquisition, rendered the story, and said, okay, who's going to tell me the story? Or who wants to learn the story? That's what it was. And so one student was called forward who may or may not have been the strongest, and I knew who the student was, and I don't think the student really was the strongest in the ranks. The student worked through the storyline, learning the story, and then I asked the question, how long do you think it would take you to tell this story without with being able to just say it on your own, without the teacher guiding you? And the student said, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 hours. And I said, let's do it now. The student had no idea. They went through the story. Having heard it once, they went through the story. And the person that was teaching had done the same thing, 2019, with a different story that I brought in. And that, again, I don't think anyone teaching the language out there could do that kind of exercise and have somebody who is a learner, a second language learner, hear a story, a very complicated story, and then stand up after hearing it once and deliver the story.
Yeah, that's impressive. Strength in numbers, it sounds like. I'm hopefully your explanation here can put this on people's radar, keep it in their minds for relevant political issues, because it really is disappointing how little Native American issues get media attention. It's almost nothing.
Well, I'm glad you recognize that, because that's the reason why organize this conference that's happening next month called Raising Indigenous Voices in Academia. And even with so here's something that's really interesting. Even with the Olympics that is going on right now in Tokyo, I don't think I saw any comment that in 1964 in Tokyo, Billy Means, a Lakota Indian, won the 10,000 meter run for the United States. And he was Indian, American Indian. That would have been a perfect time to do a flashback or bring that forward. But there it is again. Yeah, the Olympics have done these little spots on all these other ethnic groups, but I don't think I've seen anything that has addressed anything that has to do with American Indians. And there was Billy Mills in 1964 at the Tokyo Olympics, winning the 10,000 meters, which I don't think any American had done before him, beating out the favorite from nowhere. He came from nowhere, beating out the favorite, Clark. I can't remember what his first name is, but he was the favorite, and he just blew by him.
Well, hopefully, in the future, maybe there's a political moment at this point for the expansion of the importance of other cultures. It seems like so far, like we've been saying, this has excluded Native American cultures, but maybe there's a political moment where people can see the importance of it. I have one last question for you, and unfortunately it's fairly large. I know that there are different tribes, so this might not even be a relevant question, but what are the most dire problems facing the Native American community today? And I understand it's a huge question, but I do need to ask it because it doesn't get any media attention, like we say.
There are serious issues with health, both physical and mental. There were studies done back in the 60s with inner city Black families. And one of the things that they discovered was that when the roles had changed in those family dynamics, things that started coming into the communities, those communities, were things like abuse, drug addiction, substance abuse. And we're seeing that now. When the roles have changed, when one's identity has faltered, then these things start creeping in to the communities. And so one of the things that's happening on a lot of reservations are gangs. And with gangs comes various substance abuses, often drugs, most often drugs. And we're seeing a lot of that. And all people can see is the disease. They don't see the ailment. They don't see the cause of it. All they will look at is, well, look, there's all this gang stuff, culture going on, and no wonder why they're falling apart. They can't hold their self together. And this is the kind of stuff people will say. And I've seen people say that on television and in documentaries, and they don't realize the things that connect to the things that cause the problem. And part of that is group identity slipping away. And so other things happen. And that's where language comes in. You look at cultures like the Hawaiian culture, the Maori culture that a lot of people look at. It's not to say they don't have those kinds of issues there, but there is this growing population of people who have regained their language, have come back to their language, and they are creating they are not creating, but they are resubstantiating their identities as a people, who they are.
Great. Well, thank you for bringing these issues to our attention. I'd love to ask more questions, perhaps sometime in the future. But for now, I think I'll let you go. And thank you for meeting with me on such short notice. I really appreciate that.
All right. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Greymorning. I appreciate it.
All right, we'll see you.
Bye now.